Hello, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and today we'll be taking a look at a new topic. A little while ago, we examined the development of amphibious warfare doctrine and equipment by the British during the interwar period. Today we'll start looking at what the Japanese were doing at the same time in this area. As always, the sources I'm using will be found in the description for the video. So with no further ado, let's get into it. In contrast to the widespread lack of interest in preparation for amphibious warfare on the part of the British, the Japanese military was very active in this field during the interwar period. Despite the disparities between the two nations in terms of wealth, industrial capacity, and access to natural resources, the Japanese were as capable of effective, well-supported assaults from the sea as the United States was when the attack on Pearl Harbor was carried out. In terms of doctrine and actual operational forces, her military was perhaps the most capable in the world in this form of attack. Much of this would be the result of lessons learned in the landings undertaken in the course of the Empire's aggression in China, both in the 1932 Shanghai incident and in the landing operations undertaken as part of the invasion of China in 1937. As institutions, the two branches of the Japanese military were much more independent of one another than was the case in other nations. The armed forces were also institutionally independent of the war and navy ministries of the civilian government. Though inter-service rivalry and competition for resources were hardly limited to Japan, the culture and behavior of her services give the impression of a much greater degree of insularity, a sense of separate missions, and sometimes a more antagonistic relationship than was the norm. It could be expected, then, that amphibious landings, which by their nature require close cooperation between the Army, which takes the beach, and the Navy, which brings them there, would be particularly difficult for the Japanese military. This potential difficulty was in large part prevented from hindering operations by the maintenance of separate amphibious capabilities in each service. The Navy, as expected, maintained transports and landing craft, also led the way in doctrinal development and planning for amphibious warfare in the period up to the mid-1920s. The Army also maintained a fleet of transport ships, as well as its own landing craft. Landings of large numbers of troops, such as those involved in an invasion on the mainland or on a large island such as Luzon in the Philippines, would be carried out by the Army with naval support. The troops landed were not specialist Marines, but were rather regular infantry formations given some training in beach assault. The Navy's landing forces, in contrast, were based on smaller, more lightly equipped and highly mobile regiments of specialist landing troops. It was intended to capture and hold islands such as those in the Pacific, which would be held by smaller bodies of enemy troops, or to take and secure the landing zones over which the larger armored formations would then disembark. The Navy's focus on operations such as these, which might be expected to be common in a contest against the United States and the Western colonial powers in the Pacific, reveal the orientation of the Navy's outlook in the interwar period, which focus on the wide oceans and archipelagos to the east and south of the home island. The Army's focus on big landings of forces capable of fighting extended campaigns against an enemy which would be bringing large numbers of troops to bear in a major campaign likewise reflects their own strategic outlook in the decades between the wars, which saw the Empire's future in expansion on the mainland, and in which the major threat came from the Soviet Union. The Japanese, therefore, had two separate amphibious forces in being in 1941. These were capable of cooperation with one another, but also of independent operations. This organization would enable the Empire to carry out the landings on many fronts spread through the huge sweep of the world's circumference, and a dazzling succession of victories at the end of that year and into the next. The Japanese Army's interest in an independent amphibious capability stems from the general staff planning for Imperial defense requirements. These were reassessed after the end of the Great War, and the conclusions reached were embodied in two major documents: the Ohai Koryo, or Outline of Employment of Forces, and the Tokoku Kokubo Hoshin, or the Imperial Defense Policy. The 1918 version of this document stressed the need for a large-scale landing on the Philippine island of Luzon in case of a war with the United States. The 1923 revision of Imperial strategy reiterated the need to be prepared to carry out such an operation on a large island such as this as part of a war in the Pacific, and added that in such a scenario the island of Guam would have to be taken as well. At the same time, the Army determined that the need to land large forces of Army troops in the Pacific meant that they could no longer allow the Navy to bear the primary responsibility for landing operations, but must take the initiative themselves. In the Army's view, the type of landing operations that had been normal in Japanese practice up to this time had become outdated. In the past, the pattern was this. A light-armed naval infantry unit would land and secure an undefended or lightly defended portion of the enemy's coast. The Navy would then land the Army's troops there, usually using small craft or boats, tow them ashore aboard unpowered barges after transferring them from transports or civilian passenger vessels. Disembarkation of artillery and horse-drawn transport would follow, transported ashore by similar means. The landing force would establish itself ashore in a measured way, organizing itself inside a defended lodgment, before moving out and beginning its campaign against the enemy. Now, the Army saw a need to be able to put its troops ashore in battle-ready condition, ready to fight their way onto a defended beach. The greater mobility that could be expected of enemy troops made the comparatively leisurely operations of the past very vulnerable to counterattack before they could be properly formed up. Threats of air and submarine attack also posed serious hazards to shipping involved in extended disembarkations of this kind, should be immobilized off the beach from the ship-to-shore movement was accomplished. These problems only grew with the size of the force to be put ashore. A 1926 estimate of the projected campaign against the Philippines found that such an operation would require no fewer than 3 divisions to be landed this way. These factors prompted the Army to build an independent amphibious force. The Navy, unable to halt the dominant service from pursuing this program, lent it substantial support as the effort gathered momentum in the 1920s. The institutional basis for expansion in this area already existed in the form of the Rikugun Unyubu, or the Army Transportation Department, which had its headquarters in Ujina and the Hiroshima Prefecture. This entity provided and coordinated all land and waterborne transport for the Army in a similar way to that of the U.S. Army's own Quartermaster Department. A bureau of this department maintained the Army's ocean-going transport fleet and had developed strong relationships with the major players in the Japanese shipbuilding industry. Policy and oversight for this department was a province of a subdivision of the Army General Staff, namely the 3rd Bureau, which was responsible for communications and transport, of which the 8th Section, dedicated to land and sea transport, was the most relevant portion. Budgetary and logistical support was provided by the Economic Mobilization Bureau of the Ministry of War. Coordination of the activities of these entities with the larger military structure, both with the Navy and the dominant 1st Bureau of the Army General Staff, which was responsible for operational planning, was maintained through the Army's Liaison Office. The Rikugun Unyubu developed an elaborate system to provide water transport for the Army. Probably the most useful parts of this for landing operations were the so-called shipping engineer regiments. This was a 1,200-man force created to man and operate craft and landing barges. Shipping transport commands were organized to control port facilities used by the Army shipping, and specially trained and equipped debarkation units were maintained to load and unload these vessels whether in a port or over a beach. The Army also possessed staff and budgetary resources sufficient to conduct its own research and development work in this area independently of the Navy, though in fact the two services normally collaborated closely in such endeavors. In the immediate post-World War I years, the Army conducted a pair of landing exercises to gain some experience with which to formulate its requirements. One of these, staged in 1918 by the Hiroshima-based 5th Division, was a minor operation. A larger simulated landing was undertaken in 1920. One of the lessons drawn from these early exercises, as expressed by the then Chief of Staff General Uehara Masasaku, was the need for an armored, self-propelled landing craft to replace the barges and small craft that were then used in the ship-to-shore movement. Formal training and instruction in amphibious technique began the next year. In 1921 and 1922, major exercises were carried out in which a force of 3 divisions was put ashore in simulated combat conditions. For perspective, the total strength of the Japanese Army at this time was 17 divisions. Meanwhile, war games and map exercises of landing scenarios were played out both at the staff colleges and by the officers of the tactical field units at Army and divisional level. By 1925, some of the specialist amphibious craft that had been called for in the 1920 exercises began to appear. The next year, the General Staff designated 3 divisions, the 5th, the 11th, and the 12th, as those which would undertake the Luzon landings outlined in the Imperial defense policy. These units were assigned to work with the Transportation Department to refine the technique of the assault from the sea. These units were chosen partly due to the location of their home stations, which were near those of the Army's water transportation units and those of the shipping engineer regiments. The work done by these and other elements in the Army soon made it the leader in the development of Japanese amphibious doctrine, surpassing the Navy. This was reflected in the 1924 manual, the Juriku Oyobi Juriku Bogyo Sakusen Koyo, or the Summary of Amphibious Operations and Operations Defending Against Amphibious Attacks, which superseded the Navy's Kaisen Yomare, or Landing Party Manual, the guide for the conduct of operations by the naval infantry units of the fleet. The later Juriku Sakusen Koyo, or the Outline of Amphibious Operations, which was published in 1932, was the result of careful consideration of the decade's work. It was prepared by the combined staffs of the Army and Navy, and it became the authoritative manual of Japanese landing operations, and its contents represented a major advance in the technique of ship-to-shore movement, as had been demonstrated in exercises held in 1929 and again in 1931. The Navy's part in any major landing operation, according to this manual, would be to provide warships to defend the invasion convoy, both on the way to the invasion site and while the ship-to-shore movement was underway. Naval gunfire was also to be used to suppress and eliminate beach defenses, and provide fire support to the troops on the beachhead. Joint gunnery exercises were carried out with the Army beginning in 1926, but the initial results were not encouraging. Problems were identified with communications and range-finding technique, while naval ammunition was found to be less effective than had been hoped against land targets. Nonetheless, these problems were not insurmountable, and work began to increase the ability of the fleet's cruisers and destroyers to provide the kind of fire support needed by the landing forces. Meanwhile, the Army was demonstrating an increased capacity to move its troops and equipment from the transports to the beach, as a result of the increasing numbers of landing craft that it was now operating. The determination to rely only on its own efforts was cemented during the Shanghai Incident of 1932, during which the Navy landed forces without enough ammunition or heavy weapons for the kind of fighting they encountered in the city. However, the promising developments of the 20s and early 30s would be partially shipwrecked by the realities brought about by Japanese expansion on the mainland. One consequence of the resumption of the attack on China in earnest in 1937, when the Second Sino-Japanese War began, was that the 3 divisions assigned to the amphibious mission were needed in the line in China. Worse, one of these, the 11th, was decimated in the fighting around Shanghai. Not only did this mean the loss of many trained men, but it suggested that the specialist amphibious training had come at the cost of some other areas of the troops' fighting abilities. After this, no more Japanese Army units would be specifically designated as amphibious troops. Also, the experience of the landings during these opening campaigns suggested that the old style of amphibious warfare was still viable. Unopposed landings, some of which were performed by night, in which troops were established ashore in battalion-sized units dispersed along the coast and then moved to concentrate at the point of attack, proved successful at Shanghai, Qingdao, Canton, and on Hainan Island. The successes here dampened the Army's enthusiasm for retaining a capacity to carry out large-scale opposed landings. This was subsequently magnified by an increasing preoccupation among Army leadership, possibility of a mechanized, artillery-dominated war with the Soviets across the northern border of their mainland territories. While the Army was doing all of this, the Imperial Japanese Navy maintained an amphibious force of its own. As noted before, the Navy's focus was on the taking of smaller, more weakly defended targets such as islands and atolls in the Pacific, or going in first and securing the landing sites on which larger Army forces would then follow. The Army did not interfere with the Navy's efforts here, though many naval officers, viewing the requirements of the landing mission as at odds with their idea of an Imperial Navy manned by specialists and dedicated to technical excellence, were unenthusiastic about these kind of operations. The performance of the 2,000 naval infantry put ashore during the 1932 Shanghai incident, however, was considered inadequate. This despite the fact that these men were involved in house-to-house fighting in an urban environment for which they were neither trained nor well-equipped. Nevertheless, this experience spurred the creation of a permanent specialist unit of naval infantry. These would be called the Rikusentai, or the Special Naval Landing Forces, and were initially established at a strength of 1,069 officers and men. These were organized into 2 companies, each consisting of 6 infantry rifle platoons and a heavy weapons section armed with light artillery. Units of the Rikusentai were formed in the 4 major naval bases of Sasebo, Kure, Maizuru, and Yokosuka, and were designated by the base at which they were activated and the order in which they were formed, becoming, for example, the Sasebo 2nd Special Naval Landing Force. These troops looked and trained like army units of similar size, distinguished mainly by the use of naval rank and insignia. They were equipped with small arms, machine guns, and some heavier weapons such as field guns and anti-tank guns, and in some cases light or amphibious tanks. In general, however, they were lightly armed even for Japanese units. The Navy did not procure much specialized shipping or craft with which to land these troops. The Japanese Navy instead planned to bring them close ashore aboard destroyers, which would be able to support the landings with their guns, and land them in small craft such as lifeboats and cutters that were commonly found aboard warships. The Navy did acquire landing craft, but these were virtually unmodified Army types and they were procured in comparatively small numbers. The lack of specialist gear reflects the different idea of landing operations that the Navy had in mind. The Rikusentai were optimized for the kind of target that they would have to take in a campaign fought in the Central Pacific. That is, a coral atoll or weakly defended larger island such as Guam or Wake. Slipping inshore at night to land these small units by stealth, the Navy's idea emphasized surprise and speed. Much depended on the ability to make the initial landfall without opposition, so the use of fast, agile destroyers, which could run into the target shore, which could navigate narrow channels and passages and barrier reefs, and do all this in darkness, was preferred to the use of the slower, clumsier attack transports. Some Special Naval Landing Force troops were also trained in parachute operations. These men would be dropped by naval aviation to occupy the defender's attention and to complicate his defense problem. Operations of this general kind are familiar to students of the Pacific War, both at their intended targets in the opening stages of the Japanese blitzkrieg, and then in the Tokyo Express-type destroyer convoys by which reinforcements were supplied in the Solomons and New Guinea campaigns. However, as those campaigns demonstrate, this is not an ideal method of bringing large, heavily armed formations to an overseas battlefield. The need to bring in more troops and equipment, as well as casualties among the destroyers, would see the Japanese Navy resort to the expedients so well documented in those campaigns, ranging from newer ideas like the use of submarines as transports, to the revival of older techniques, such as the commonly seen use of towed barges. These methods were wasteful in lives and resources, and ineffective in bringing enough force to stop the Allies in those 2 theaters. The fact that the Japanese were compelled to resort to such means to hold on to their newly won islands was the result of the separate paths chosen by the Army and Navy in the interwar period. This division in capabilities was successfully exploited by the Allies, who changed the conditions under which the Japanese system was made to operate. This was accomplished by the establishment of American air power in the battle area, which made the use of the relatively slow attack transports extremely risky. The overall result of this was that the Japanese proved unable to use their previously developed capacity in this area in an offensive manner once their overall strategy had gone over to the defensive. Only the fast destroyer convoys, which were not capable of landing forces strong enough to turn the tide, were able to use the hours of darkness to run in and land their payloads and then make it back out of range of American strike planes. This led to the large Army forces being forced to rely on an instrument meant only to support smaller naval infantry operations. Once the Allies had gained the strategic initiative, troops who had carried out the brilliant amphibious offensives of late 1941 and 42 became static island garrisons, and their specialized amphibious shipping and landing craft were used in a purely logistical role to keep them supplied. And so that is where I will end this video. Hope you found some of this interesting or useful. Thanks for watching, and we'll continue with part 2 of this series shortly. In the meantime, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.